Let's start with what is a WBS, and basically we're breaking down all of the work required to meet the project outcomes. From a practical perspective, this would vary on context, but a lot of times the WBS has actually been identified before the engagement of a project team. In many cases, it's included in the response to a request for quote, tender, and so on. So in many regards, developing a WBS isn't something that someone on the project team member would necessarily do on every project. So if already defined, it may still be worth having the project team do a review, have a look at the requirements. It's amazing what a fresh pair of eyes can see. But look, let's say a smaller project or maybe an internal project, there would be situations where the project team could contribute or even develop the WBS. With this in mind, my expectations from a project team member would include, primarily being able to assist in breaking down the key components of the project. For example, part A, B, C, and so on. For example, let's say you're writing an article for social media. You would have things like the research, the writing, the editing, the publishing. So they're what we call the main categories. I'd expect that to be done in a logical manner and to make sure it captures the whole gambit of the scope of works. So that would be number one. Secondly, would be the requirement to identify the tasks within each of these categories in sufficient depth to allow the project to be managed and controlled. In many cases, that would require an understanding of the subject matter, or for the project team to work with a technical expert to break the project down to deeper levels. How deep do you need to go is the million-dollar question. For me, it's a function of understanding. If we're handing the task, or if it's being delegated to someone who's an expert in the field, we may not need that depth. But if we're handing it to someone who's very new, we might need that greater depth and control. So for example, if we're giving the writing task, using the article example, to someone who writes social media posts, we might just say, write a post on this topic. If we're giving it to someone who's never worked in the field or who is new to it, or we want to keep that control, we might break it down to a greater level. So example, we might include things like, create your dot points, flesh out each dot points, write your first draft, so on, so on, so on. And I guess that's what I'm expecting from someone when they're writing or developing, I guess as you've asked, the WBS. I want to make sure, as I said initially, they can primarily define the 4 or 5 main categories. And secondly, in each of those categories, they can break the project down to sufficient depth. And think about sufficient depth as if I gave this instruction, let's call it instruction, to someone who's going to do the work, would they be able to deliver on the outcomes? Would the project be able to be tracked, controlled, managed, reviewed? They're the key questions I'm asking. Look, and I think if a candidate is able to break down the work from a client's request to the level where it can be, as I said, effectively managed, I think that is sufficient in meeting the skills you've asked. And in summary for this point, I think everyone has an obligation in a project to develop the scope of works to as much detail as possible. The better we define the scope, the better off our whole project will be. Cool. That's my response for that one.